Hi, you're listening to Crime Tapes. The overall podcast is about the topic of crime and criminology. And more broadly, it's created by Staffordshire University and the School of Law, Policing and Forensics, and focuses each week on a subject of crime that's covered here at Staffs. And this week, we're joined by Mark Brown, Senior Lecturer in English, to talk about the topic of crime literature. Now, while we tend to talk about criminology as sort of formed of academic subjects and expertise, and Kyla and I are interested in an array of sort of criminology books that tend to deal with the theoretical substance of the subject, I often think that the thing that hooks people into crime and criminology is the real connection and the connection to the real world. And so while people often think of criminology as involving the sort of heavy-end study of theoretical ideas, quite a lot of the time, in actual fact, we're looking at true crime and true crime materials, and that can also be a part of criminology. Now, today, in particular, we're going to focus in on one of those sort of seminal true crime accounts that comes from the United States of America, a book that is well known not only in criminological circles, but that's studied by students taking subjects such as English. And as we've said previously, you may get something out of this podcast if you have read Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. But similarly, if you haven't read that book, the podcast may be an introduction that talks to you about it and may inspire you to then go out and have a look at that text and read it. But just generally as well, I'm quite keen to talk about true crime in regard to criminology and true crime literature, and we may make more podcasts on that in the future. So for today, I'm joined by Mark Brown and my colleague Kyla Lawton, and we're going to be discussing Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. So just to introduce that for us, Mark, could you tell us a little bit about Capote's book and what it's about?
I certainly can, and thank you very much for inviting me on. It's lovely to meet other people from other parts of the university and talk about shared interests, so it's really cool. I think your introduction is really important. People are interested in crime. There's a public appetite for the consumption of crime through things like films, podcasts, and books. So it's interesting to think about the way in which this novel answered that interest and that appetite, but also the way in which it kind of reflects upon that. It's quite self-knowing about why people are drawn to mass killers. Absolutely. Why are people fascinated with this dark side of human nature and the human condition?
Absolutely, and it's a subject that unites so much of true crime literature. But also, I think one of the things that was interesting to me earlier on is I was thinking about the genre more broadly and sort of true crime, and I suppose in some ways we ought to say a little bit about what true crime is and how it's regarded as a sort of genre, because in some ways a lot of what people think about crime and criminality, and certainly criminologists would talk about this, would come from those sort of fictional representations, whereas when we talk about true crime, in a way, we're talking about something different. But I guess as someone involved in English, you may know that in some ways the boundaries between fact and fiction are not necessarily always all that clear, and that's something that we might come on to. But to sort of to show that in a way, one of the books that I've used and suggested students read before coming on a criminology course, is just because I think it's really engaging and it's quite recent, is called "You Could Do Something Amazing with Your Life. You Are Raoul Moat," and that book by Andrew. I forget the guy's surname. It's really, really interesting. Published in about 2016. Andrew Hankinson, I think it was. It's really, really interesting book. What it does is it retells, much in a similar way to In Cold Blood, the story of Raoul Moat's sort of shooting rampage, but built on documentary evidence and interviews. And in some ways, that's perhaps partly what true crime is, or that would be my understanding. Could you tell us a bit more?
I will, yeah. Well, true crime is a genre that actually has been around as long as crime fiction. It starts with Poe. really, and I'll come on to that a bit in a minute. But this is a very popular book today, and it's kind of become a sort of totemic text in talking about true crime fiction. As you say, it has a seminal place in the development of it because it's so self-conscious of its status and the way in which Capote approaches his subject matter. And what the novel does is it traces the commission and the consequences of a mass murder of the wealthy farming Clutter family. And it takes place in a very small rural community, which is important for Capote and for his readers.
So the crime itself, when does that happen? And
1959. Right,
1959. So we're on the sort of cusp of the 1960s and a change in society in the US, I guess.
Yeah. It's still a very rigid society. What's interesting about the novel is you can read it as a Cold War novel. In a way, Capote is a fascinating figure. He's openly gay when it's still, and flamboyantly gay, at a time when it's illegal to be homosexual. And in New York, where he lives, he's not from New York, he's from Alabama. So he's escaped small-town America, gone to New York and lives this very celebrity lifestyle. He's famous for the black and white ball, which happens some years after this, where everybody who was anybody was there. Celebrities, politicians, anybody who was in the news, but everybody had to wear black and white, and the whole thing was decked out in black and white. So he's a very famous kind of celebrity author.
I'm going to be really honest. I did buy the book, but I've not got round to reading it. It's going to sound terrible. I've got about 2 or 3 chapters in. So could you give me just a quick synopsis of the book, please?
I certainly can. So it traces the commission and the consequences of the mass murder of the wealthy Clutter family, who live in a small rural community in Kansas, and that's really important. The murders take place at River Family Farm in Holcomb, which is itself a suburb of Garden City, in Kansas. And this pastoral nature of the setting, the names of the places, they give the author the opportunity to draw really stark contrast between the brutality of the slayings, and he pulls no punches in portraying and representing the suffering that is kind of part of the crime and its consequences afterwards. The victims are tied up and shot at close range with a shotgun. Herb Clutter, the father and the patriarch of the family, has his throat cut. So it's a brutal slaying. But at the same time, Capote is acutely aware of the public appetite for the sensational details of these exceptional crimes and the contrast between the lives of the victims and the lives of the perpetrators. And this, in a sense, is his project. He wants to draw distinctions but also comparisons between the people involved. And it's very much a composition. He brings together the materials of the story in a very careful, crafted and shaped way. I use the idea of composition deliberately when talking about the novel, because we think about composition when we talk about poetry, when we talk about music. We don't really think about composing a true story. But Capote, he's a brilliant craftsman, he's a brilliant writer, and his place within the text is one of the things that he toys with, he plays with us as a reader. So the murders take place in 1959. In November, Capote arrives there in Holcomb shortly after that, but he sends a researcher ahead of him, and that researcher is Harper Lee, who he lived next door to in Alabama.
Now, I've read her book.
Yeah. So To Kill a Mockingbird is in the process of being published when this takes place. So she's not a household name at this point, but she's the kind of the epitome of Southern charm.
Nothing like academia nowadays, then, where the established male sends out the female to do the research for them.
No, not at all.
No commonality at all.
Harper Lee, she, from accounts, is the kind of driving force in the research for this. She's the one interviewing people. She's the one doing all the talking. And Capote just sits there sort of in the background smoking and drinking. He turns up at people's houses with a bottle of whiskey and just sits in the corner.
As I say, nothing like academia now.
Not at all.
I can't speak for
I'm making no comment. No, I'm making no comment on criminology at this point.
So Capote's accounts of the murders appeared first as a series of articles in the New Yorker magazine. They didn't appear till 1965, when the trials come to an end. So this is a long process. And they appear around the time that the murderers convicted and hanged. The New Yorker is a place, it was known then and it still is, as a place where the finest writing, journalistic writing and fictional writing find a home. And the essays were really well received. There's a lot of enthusiasm for them. So with the encouragement of the New Yorker, he works them up into a novel, and he calls it a non-fiction novel. And I think that's really important, because the idea of composing a true story suggests two things which are in tension with each other. Can it be a novel and can it be true? Is it a documentary? What kind of form does it belong to? But we can see Capote's work as a really early contribution to a new kind of literature that's emerging at this very moment. He's right at the very forefront of this. And so there's people like Tom Wolfe, who's author of Bonfire of the Vanities, which comes later, Norman Mailer, Armies of the Night, Michael Hare's Dispatches about his time in Vietnam.
Norman Mailer as well, Executioner's Song on Gary Gilmore later, which I think wins a Pulitzer, doesn't it? So it's again
that kind of exchange between journalism, documentary writing and fiction, kind of finding their expression in all of these people. And the greatest of all these kind of writers, Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. And his, interesting, talking about ethnography earlier on, his first work, when he went sort of not undercover, he just turned up with the
Hells Angels. Absolutely.
I just want to write about you.
Well, we still, and this again is the overlap in some ways with the subject, because although people don't necessarily take Hunter S. Thompson, the end of that is clearly having got very sort of close to the Hells Angels. He's beaten up and assaulted, which is
nearly to death.
Which is that classic warning of be careful how you enter into these groups and how you begin to perceive of them for ethnographers. That there can be risk in these fields as well. But like I say, it's interesting in that the overlap between. In some ways, what we regard as the subject for literature or criminology, again, is perhaps not so established as one might think.
Yeah, I agree with you. Those boundaries are blurred, and I think this type of literature, this new journalism, deliberately blurs those boundaries. They want to draw the reader to start think about those distinctions and about the veracity of the material as you're reading it.
Yeah, so in a way, you should be questioning, I suppose, the truth claims that are being made, which is an interesting thing, because the genre, in a way, when described as true crime, makes you think, well, this is real, but as you're saying, it's an account of something that happened, which may not be
100% accurate.
Yeah,
exactly.
It'd be the nuances, won't it? So, for example, did he really clean his teeth in the mirror that morning? Did he think what he actually thought? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's that sort of the grey areas. It's where you sort of put the poetic license in.
Yeah, and what we do as readers is, the casual reader is quite happy to gloss over these things and not differentiate between the material, but the careful reader, which I think your criminology students and our English students should be careful readers, is they're reading this and asking, well, what kind of material is being used here? What are the narrative strands that are being wound together into this narrative? And, where does the objective, neutral perspective lie? And what's reimagined? Because he can't know everything. He's only got the accounts of the people who were there, and also they're going to be incomplete, and they're going to be very subjective. So when he's talking to the murderers, he's going to get their side of the story. When he's talking to the police, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, he's going to get their side of the story. And it's really interesting to read the little bits that he inserts in between that are about, as you say, getting up in the morning and looking at yourself in the mirror and cleaning your teeth and looking yourself in the eye in the mirror and asking what kind of person you are. Capote doesn't know that. He's not inside the head of the murderers. What he is he gets closer to the murderers than possibly anybody had to up to that point, and since. The one thing I can't help thinking is the level of access he had to Dick Hickok and Perry Smith would be unthinkable now. The idea that a writer would be allowed into the prison to spend time with convicted murderers who are waiting, on a one-to-one basis.
Yeah.
Is, I think, really interesting. So the level of access that he's got and the relationships he was able to form with the two killers are interesting, and obviously from an ethical perspective, how do we view this?
Absolutely.
So obviously, I think what everyone's going to be thinking now is, so why did they do it? So what did he get from them? Why did they do it?
Well, what they got was a portable radio and around $40. The reason they went there was that Dick Hickok, who the book portrays very much as the driving force behind the crime, had been told that there was a safe there with tens of thousands of dollars in cash in it. So he'd gone there with the express purpose of finding what would have been a significant life-changing amount of money. They could have then fled to South America and lived the high life. There's also a very strong suggestion in the book that Hickok is driven by a desire, a paedophilic obsession with young women, and he knows that the Clutters have a 16-year-old daughter, and he goes in pursuit of that. And there's a number of incidents in the book where we see Hickok pursuing very young girls, and there's little moments of awareness where normally Capote allies us as readers with the consciousness of Perry Smith, and he paints him as a much more sympathetic character, but the odd moment that he does ally us with the consciousness of Hickok, it's very much about the way in which he struggles with his obsession with young girls, and that actually is what motivates him, that he is a dangerous paedophile.
In making these suggestions, in a way, is Capote's obviously making marking out a difference in how he sees the two perpetrators, the individuals involved. In terms of knowing the book and then what's been described about it afterwards, did he have a particularly different relationship with the two central characters? Because he obviously got access to them in prison, managed to talk to them. Is there a difference in how he perceives the perpetrators, and is there a difference in terms of his relationship with them?
There's a stark difference. His relationship with Perry seems to be very positive. There's a sort of flow of sympathies, if you like, between the two men. Perry Smith is gay, and so is Capote. There is a suggestion that they were lovers during Perry's time in prison before he's executed, and so they became inappropriately close, shall we say, which goes back to that point about the idea of sort of the ethical dimension of the relationship between the documentary maker and the subject. He also, the way in which he uses the materials that he has at his disposal, is he portrays Dick Hickok as bad. He's evil. There's nothing in his background to explain his behaviour and the brutality and his criminality, other than this sexual drive and this sort of paedophilic desire. What we get in contrast with Perry Smith is a very sympathetic portrayal of his background as tragic. He's an outsider. He suffers some physical deformities as a result of a motorcycle accident, which Capote really emphasises, describes him as much shorter, the size of a 12-year-old, having feet that would fit in women's dancing pumps. So he kind of feminises Perry in a way that he doesn't with Dick Hickok. He also draws a lot on, so we were talking about the materials that constitute the book, letters, personal letters between Perry and his father, between Perry and his sister, parole accounts that show him in a good light. When it comes to Dick Hickok, quite a normal background, and he can't find an explanation for why he goes off the rails.
Which is interesting in and of itself, because in actuality it's Smith that's got if I'm right in recalling, Smith's got a criminal background, hasn't he?
Well, they both have. They've both been in prison.
So there's this tendency to sort of contrast as, good and bad in a way is perhaps elective or selective. I don't know.
Well, this is about editing, isn't it? This is about putting all the evidence on the table and then finding your way through the evidence to arrive at the conclusion that you want to arrive at. And we can see the book as an investigation. The evidence is there.
Right, so who actually did the killing?
They both did.
Right, so, because this is something that I've just picked up on, maybe others won't. So, could this be the fact that, say, for example, if I met two people and I took an instant dislike to somebody, that we could have a different account of the way these people actually were based on, like you said, it looks like he had a relationship with one of them. So, could he could his perceptions be skewed, so to speak? So at the end of the day, we're not actually getting the true account of how these people actually really were. We've just got his opinions of them.
I think you're right. Yeah, as readers, we don't really know. We only have Capote's word for it. And what's interesting is he doesn't insert himself into the text in any meaningful way. He's the documentary maker who isn't in his own documentary. You feel he's, I don't know, the voice behind the camera who asks the questions of the interviewee, and then you edit out his questions.
Yes. Yeah.
So what you seem to get is this objective neutrality, but what you actually get is this very...
because there's no such thing as objective neutrality. I'm just going to get that.
Well,
everybody's got a position.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody comes from a certain position unless they've lived in this sort of like hermetically sealed bubble and then just let out into the world. So.
Well, it's interesting in that, that style is not the only one that can be used, because there are obviously authors, you mentioned Hunter Thompson, who don't edit themselves out but very much make themselves part of the text. And I guess the other thing that's interesting, and it's where my knowledge isn't great on In Cold Blood, is that he's not only editing himself out, but he's also then editing out Harper Lee, who's acted for him as well. And I wonder then, did she have a similar view of ultimately of the events and the product? Who knows?
We don't know.
Yeah. I mean, that would in and of itself be quite interesting. So did she ever meet Smith and Hickok?
Not that I'm aware of. It'd be much more difficult for a woman to go into a man's prison.
Yeah, sure.
And have that kind of access.
Yeah. But so he largely used her to access people in the community.
Indeed, yes.
Whereas the relationship with Smith and Hickok was formed through him, and therefore he gives a voice to them but removes himself from it.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
But when it came to the actual kind of the committing of the crime, Hickok took Smith along because he thought he was a psychopath, and in prison and out, he'd spoken of being a killer, and a kind of random killer, sort of motivated purely by the thrill of killing rather than with an end result in sight. And Smith had kind of put these stories out there to make himself a more credible kind of, villain, a bad guy in prison and amongst criminals. And really, it's these stories that he was telling. In a way, he's a bit of a fantasist. And from the account, Hickok's quite a kind of persuasive figure, and Smith looks up to him and wants to kind of be taken along on this adventure. So he tells Dick Hickok the stories that he thinks Dick Hickok wants to hear. Hickok then kind of plans the whole thing based on what he assumes to be the psychotic nature of his accomplice to be. And it turns out actually, or the story we're given by Capote, is that actually he isn't a killer, and he doesn't want to do this. He has a conscience in a way that Dick Hickok doesn't.
Well,
However,
hang
he is
on
the
a
one.
minute. Just
He
if
is
you
the
are a
one.
psychopath, if you are a narcissist, you can be pretty much what anybody wants you to be. So at the end of the day, he may have been well up for it, but once he spoke to the author, could sit there and say, "Well, you want me to be this," and that is classic sort of psychopathic. Sorry, get that out again. Teeth.
It's the classic psychopathic
behaviour,
Yeah.
and you know that you do change who you are with if you.
Well, manipulation
Yeah,
and grooming
massively-
occurs in all sorts of different
Yeah.
contexts, doesn't it? And there could be the suggestion, therefore, that and it's interesting if we think about our contemporary versions. Another great book, another great true crime account that we use that's in that new journalist style in criminology is Blake Morrison's As If. Which is the account of he sat in on the trial of the murderers of James Bulger. It's an incredibly moving, powerful book. I still recommend it to students who very often hear about the Bulger case, but not the fullest facts. Whereas putting himself into the story and attending the court and speaking with people and so on, Morrison's account is perhaps much, much better. And the reason it makes me think of that is initially in the case of the Bulger murder, we had very much this sort of narrative being framed, again, where one is worse than the other. And in the case of the Bulger murder, it was Thompson was bad and Venables was the slightly better, more easily led individual that didn't necessarily, commit as freely, was from a slightly better family, had slightly better chances. His mum was there in court more. He was more present, more middle class, although firmly working class. Whereas Thompson came from the family with the Wild brothers, the boy who was troubled. Of course, what subsequently materialises with their release is Thompson goes off and leads thus far a life where seemingly he now has a family, he's out of the public eye under a protected identity, and Venables, the more sympathetic character, is actually seemingly the worst of the two. So I guess again there's something interesting, isn't there, even in this story that we're being given about, this is a toxic partnership that forms up, but which one's the bad one? Mm-hmm. And it may well be that the account that we're being presented with, we perhaps ought to question.
We should always question, yeah. We can't ever know the author's intentions. We only have the text to work with.
Yeah.
But what we have is a very sympathetic portrayal of Perry Smith, a much narrower, much less detailed portrayal of Dick Hickok, but one which does show him to be unmotivated and other than just by, he's just a wrong-un.
And I suppose in some ways that at the same time though, we ought to, Capote is an intelligent guy who's got fuller facts than perhaps we have. So this presentation may well be that a great many people would make had they been inserted into similar circumstances as well. So at the same time, while we're saying, sort of be critical in a way, there is also the counter side that there may be a good grain of truth in it, because like you say, he was describing this as a crime novel that's based on truth. I think it was what you said earlier on. So I guess he is at least trying to say this is the accurate presentation of what went on.
Yeah, he uses that word non-fiction.
Yeah.
So, he is making truth claims, as you said at the beginning. I think what's interesting is we assume the readers come to crime fiction, true crime fiction, because they're just interested in salacious detail and sensational events and want to get inside the heads of people who do really bad things. But I think there's something much deeper going on with Capote's novel, which is that he is looking for who's to blame, not literally who cuts the throat of which victim and who pulls which trigger at which point, but is there a wider kind of social point to be made here about what makes two young men who go into prison really as just petty thieves. These are people who have gone to prison for passing bad checks and stealing cars.
What makes them worse? What makes them the
how do they go from that to killing a whole family?
And on that theme, what does Capote? What's he sort of suggesting? What's he arguing?
he's trying to argue two contradictory things at the same time, I think. And that is that some people are just bad. Hickok is mad and bad and dangerous, whereas Perry Smith is the result of a terrible childhood. A mother who's a drunk. There's a whole kind of series. There is a class dimension to this, and a racial dimension to this as well, in that Perry Smith is half Cherokee, and being Native American in the 1950s was still sort of seen as an outsider status.
Yeah.
He's homosexual. He carries these deformities, which, as I say, Capote emphasises. When you see pictures of these people, he isn't the size of a 12-year-old at all. He's just normal size.
And you said about the motorbike accident. He was addicted to aspirin, wasn't he?
He was, yes.
I seem to remember, which is a sort of strange addiction to have in a way, and thought of through sort of contemporary standards, but a lot of the time quite sort of a pained individual physically as a result of this accident, which also transfers itself into this sort of pained soul who's broken by nurture, as it were, rather than nature in contrast.
Yeah, he plays the guitar, he sings, he makes up songs, and these kind of inhabit the narrative from time to time. He carries all his worldly goods in a number of cardboard boxes, which he has to mail on to post offices, to places where he's heading, because it weighs too much to carry. But it's all letters and photographs, and he tries to construct a personality, a self, out of these materials, which sort of has there's a pathos to it, which isn't there with the other character. It's interesting because Dick Hickok also has deformities as a result of a motor accident, and he's suffered facial injuries, and he describes his face as being put back together like two misaligned halves of an apple. But instead of saying, "Oh, isn't this sad?" he says, "Oh, we shouldn't make assumptions about people's appearance and their personality, but," and then he goes on to do exactly that. He describes him as being venomous. And he has this look in his eye, which he looks evil, and then he's portrayed as evil, and he's always portrayed as the one that's kind of pushing for the crime to happen.
Interesting. In terms of the US when this is being written, as well, though, I guess we're entering into a period of sort of quite profound social change in a way. Certainly on the horizon, technology is changing. I guess the setting is very much rural, Midwestern America, isn't it? Which I think of more recent sort of cultural references to Midwestern America. It's sort of invoked by people like Eminem, the rapper, nowadays, as a way of sort of suggesting all that's bad about sort of repressive middle class United States. But I guess the US is changing quite a lot at that particular time as well. Is that a part of In Cold Blood? Does that sort of feature in the narrative?
It does. Herb's a really interesting character. The way, we've talked a lot about the bad guys, about the killers, but the perpetrators. But he's very keen. He spends a lot of time talking about the victims. He talks about Herb Clutter. He's a self-made man. He's very much a settlement kind of frontier figure. This is the very middle of America. This is the prairies. This is big ranches, big farming. He's very wealthy. He's not the richest man in his community because he's too selfless in a way. He could be.
He's a nice guy.
He's all American.
Yeah, all American. Yeah.
But he's not introverted. It would be very easy to see Capote's portrayal of the Midwest as nostalgic. It is pastoral, River Valley Farm and Garden City. These are places with pretty names. But Herb's outlook is outwards. He's served in state government. He's served in federal government. He's known in the committee rooms of Washington D.C. because he's played a part in the agricultural policy of national and state government. But he's also the chair of the committee that raises funds for the new Methodist Church in Garden City. He's very much he's a very well-known character in his community. But he's And the reason he's so wealthy is actually he's adopted very modern farming methods. He's a progressive, technological figure within his community as well as a good guy. And it's really interesting. Capote almost ignores Kenyon, the son. Portrays him as slightly lumbering and a bit oafish. He's short-sighted and he can't find his glasses and he's a bit thick. So he just kind of appears, bumbles around a bit and then gets shot. That's his role. But the daughter, Nancy, is portrayed as a version of American womanhood. She teaches the other girls in the community how to bake. She goes steady with Bobby Rupp, who enters the narrative very early on. And so she's a good girl, but she's a version of American femininity, which fits perfectly in the Cold War version of America. And of course, the Cold War creates a culture of conformity, expectations that come all the way down from federal government through state, city, and wider society. Gender roles are very rigid, and she conforms to those. So there's a sort of status quo. There's an established social order which everybody recognises, and what the killers represent is a threat to that.
Which I suppose in the sort of dawn of the 1960s, as you're coming into a period which is going to be marked by civil unrest with the civil rights movement, with the Vietnam War, which is, going to see man go to the moon, Kennedy be assassinated, second wave feminism, the Stonewall riots. I mean, in some ways, it's almost a sort of perfect portrait of a historical period on the cusp of
so they're like the
something
family,
very
so
different.
they're the embodiment of the American dream at that time, and this book is basically they killed the American dream.
Yeah, the Clutters of the American dream, the killers of the American nightmare.
Yeah, and I suppose sort of subsequently that American nightmare of true crime has been, although it has become sort of known as true crime in a way, not a non-fiction crime novel. That genre of true crime grows at least out of that period, and I guess in part it's the successes of Capote's In Cold Blood that at least partially drive that, because I'm thinking about other sort of classic accounts that come up. We mentioned Hunter Thompson's Hell's Angel, but stuff like Helter Skelter on the Manson family subsequently, and a whole array then of writing that essentially uses a much more sort of factual basis of sort of documenting crime and the realities of it. Very often the sort of more extreme forms, so we are talking perhaps emblematic murders. I think of other true crime accounts we use. I mentioned Blake Morrison's As If, but things like Columbine, more recently, really well documented by a sort of investigative reporter. You get lots and lots of other accounts but I suppose Capote sets the template, as it were, for how it could be done.
Well, you could argue that this goes back to the middle of the 19th century, actually. When you look, the advent of detective fiction, crime fiction, is Edgar Allan Poe's stories about Dupin, written in the 1840s. And the middle story of those three, so he writes Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is very famous, obviously. And then he writes The Mystery of Marie Roget, and then subsequently The Purloined Letter. And The Mystery of Marie Roget is the story of Mary Rogers, who falls into the river in New York and disappears. And there's a massive kind of newspaper media campaign about what's happened to Mary Rogers. This vulnerable young woman has disappeared from the streets of New York without explanation. There must be some terrible. Something terrible's befallen her, and the account that Poe writes is actually Dupin's investigation, but just using newspaper accounts. So Poe, in the middle of the 19th century, is really conscious of the fact that the public, the newspaper reading public, the consumers of this stuff, are absolutely fascinated and drawn to stories of murder and violence and mystery.
Yeah.
So it goes all the way back to Mary Rogers, Marie Roger. He just moves it to Paris and thinly veiled.
And it's one of the ones I was thinking about earlier as well. Is it's interesting then how those two become the sort of fiction and factual elements and that interplay, although largely true and not non-fiction, become in subsequent generations, they've become even more the stuff of marking out the contemporary period. And thinking about others, the novelist James Ellroy, who writes the
My Dark Places.
My Dark Places,
yeah,
absolutely,
it's a really good example.
Which is his account of his own mother's murder, isn't it? And so, but of course, Ellroy is also known for writing essentially a range of fiction novels as well. So there's that sort of
Black Dahlia and
absolutely. So there's that sort of interplay of where is the fact and where is the fiction. And I guess one of the things that's interesting for me about Capote is that method of doing this as a way that the true novel opens up those questions about where are the boundaries between the fact and the fictional elements.
Yeah, he becomes quite conscious of that. Much later on in the novel, once the men have hanged, he meets, Dewey, the Alvin Dewey. We haven't talked about him at all. Yeah, every crime fiction needs a detective, and we get one. So Alvin Dewey's the guy from the KBI, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and he's responsible for solving the crime, and solving in inverted commas, very much so. But he meets one of Nancy's friends in the graveyard where she's buried subsequently, and it's a very kind of romanticized view of a way of drawing a conclusion, because it needs a solution, it needs closure, it needs a narrative resolution that actually we've had at the beginning. We know from the outset that 2 people killed 4 people, and those 2 people died as a result of their crimes. So the mystery is solved from the very beginning. So the question is an interesting one: is why do we keep reading?
Yeah, we know how the story ends. Why do we keep going?
What is Capote's project? And part of it is this idea of who's to blame. What we don't know from the beginning is who shoots who cuts whose throat, who is the psychopath and who's sort of just drawn along in the wake of a much dominant figure. But we're also drawn along by who's to blame. What are the consequences of a crime this terrible on a community that small? Because one of the things that he works with throughout the novel is that the idea that this community suffers a sort of really kind of a profound rupture as a result of that. And it goes back to your point, actually, about America changing. And the difference between America in 1959 and 1965 is the difference between, a very kind of staid, stable, uncontroversial society in some respects. And then by 1965, you've got the emergence of a really significant youth culture. The civil rights movement as gaining momentum in a way that it couldn't possibly in the 1950s. Yeah. So issues of race and gender and class and sexual orientation are much more central by the time that the men hang. So, what is it that we're drawn to? What are the questions that Capote asks? And how, once he's set up this mystery, what keeps us reading for 300 and something pages? And then how does he kind of resolve his narrative? And he does it with this kind of completely imagined scenario.
So in terms of engagement now with students when they come to study English, when you're looking at texts, this would be one of the texts that you'd look at in sort of and I keep using, because it's how we describe it in criminology, sort of true crime or new journalism or non-fiction crime. What would be the sort of other accounts that would perhaps prove seminal alongside it? Because you mentioned the Poe texts earlier on.
Yes.
Are there accounts more recently that you'd guide students towards, or?
We read this as part of the development of crime fiction. So we're looking at the way in which the genre changes from its inception up to the present day.
Yeah.
So we start with Poe, and we look at Murders in the Rue Morgue. We look at the construction of the detective, and I think the way that, in a way, Capote is really conscious of the fact that he needs to include the conventional elements of crime fiction. So we need a crime, we need suspects, we need evidence, we need witnesses.
It's Conan Doyle or Christie as much as it is in some ways anything else. It's working towards this template model.
Yeah.
Do you think also there's an element of they need the ideal victim as well?
Yes. Yeah, they need the ideal victim, but also they need the ideal perpetrator. People who are drawn to crime fiction, true crime fiction and non-true crime fiction, you sort of ask the reason why. Why do so many people... This is a genre that's been in existence for nearly 200 years and it hardly changes. There's little kind of nuances around the edges. But the bits that make it up remain fairly stable. There's very few people who change it. And it still sells in massive quantities.
I think one of the things that's interesting about that is it opens up that question about why would someone engage in this process? There are questions about, when people are coming into sort of processes of giving their account, what are they seeking out of it? What are they?
Well, we live in a society where fame is everything at the end of the day, and if you can't be famous by normal means, if you're going to go and kill somebody, what better way? You're not just going to be somebody who kills somebody. Do it properly. Get some fame, notoriety out of it.
Fame, notoriety, place in history.
Yeah, exactly.
Your side of the account. I wonder. What do you think, Mark? I mean, in terms of In Cold Blood, why did Hickok and Smith give Capote the time of day, and what did they want?
Well, they've got less to gain than contemporary celebrity seekers, because you're going to come out of prison at some point, and you can then, I don't know, go on radio shows, you can publish books, you can become part of this industry of telling people about crime and criminals and what motivates them. These guys were going to hang. They were always going to hang. There was no mercy in the system in the 1950s in Midwest America. So what do they get? They get to put their side of the story. They get to justify their actions. They get to show the suffering that leads from childhood through to petty criminal, petty larceny, the experience of the prison system, and then subsequently, moving on to sort of really major crime.
I mean, just thinking about it, there's something interesting in that, in a way, in that it's reminiscent even of the sort of Newgate style pamphlets that are published in the UK, where people give their scaffold address, well, learn from me what made me a bad 'un, and I face my maker, gov, with, which was some of the sort of first written down accounts and printed accounts that had a wider public appeal. But I guess that's also something we ought to think about. Why do people engage with In Cold Blood or any of the now array of true crime, non-fiction crime accounts that are out there?
Escapism,
what is it?
Isn't it?
Is it escapism?
Well, would you want to escape to something nice rather than something awful?
Well, to be fair, there is a lot of stuff out there that says that people do want to escape to the macabre. Why is horror a genre that everybody loves? Why are we excited when we hear about a serial killer? At the end of the day, we have this sort of like safe capitalist environment where we are consuming, we consume, we work, we go to bed, we sleep, we get up, we repeat the process. Whereas these people are sort of fulfilling something that we don't get to fulfill. Why is it that we want to sit there and play video games while we kill people? Why is it we want to read this stuff? This is an escape from that mundane monotony. And
but there's also I suppose a drawing of the boundaries and that sort of comparing and contrasting ourselves with them, and you see a bit of that in Cold Blood.
I think you do. I think, Capote represents us in a way, the law-abiding public. The vast majority of humanity in any society that don't go around stealing things, breaking things, taking things, killing people. And so there's an interesting inverse relationship, I think, between the popularity of true crime fiction and the amount of crime out there. It seems that, events like this are becoming more and more unusual, but the interest in them goes in the opposite direction.
Yeah.
So I think there's this idea that, we live in a stable society, sort of moderated and controlled by ideas of consumption, and earning the money to consume and consuming to earn the money and in a cycle, which is quite mundane. But there's these people outside who aren't observing the rules. They come in sort of as an other, capital O and in inverted commas, and they break the rules. They disrupt the social order that is fairly well established.
As a final question, though, in amongst all of that, Capote clearly doesn't see himself in that mould, perhaps, because he's, in some ways, he's certainly, I guess, by the time of publication, he's a sensation, he's a cause celebrity, he's well known and so on. But as you say, one of the things criminology teaches, the them and us, the lawbreaker and the law abiding, is actually quite often a thin line, and there are aspects of Capote's own personality, even at that time, which made him very much the outsider. He could, be prosecuted. Oscar Wilde was prosecuted for his sexuality and placed in Reading jail. Capote in America at the time faced persecution. He could easily have been regarded as the deviant or the lawbreaker, but he doesn't fully he doesn't regard that as the norm, does he, in a way?
No, and I think that's partly kind of emphasised by his absence from the text. I think he recognises and sympathises with another outsider.
Yes.
But without having to make that.
But another
position
outsider who's very similar to him.
Yes.
Yeah. We can find sympathy, but when they're like us, which is
so
interesting. He's
clearly drawn to that figure. He emphasises aspects of that figure's personality and experience, and because of that, he's able to sort of stand slightly outside the text without having to reveal too much about himself. But he is wealthy. He is well known. He has his celebrity status. Interestingly, by the time this is published, or around the time this is published, his best known novel, Breakfast at Tiffany's, is made into a movie, which is one of the most glamorous and shiny and happy movies on the planet, with Audrey Hepburn. But actually, if you read the novel or the novella, there's something slightly bleak about it, and we can actually read Holly Golightly not as this fantastic woman sort of swanning around New York with a cigarette holder, but actually as a cross-dressing boy arriving in New York and trying to find their way in the sort of nighttime gay community and society, and so it kind of, that outsider thing, the rule breaker and the transgressor, is very much part of his project here.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. So I think it takes us to a good point where we've almost concluded Capote's story and talk more broadly as well about our contemporary and historical consumption of true crime or true crime novel, or I suppose that even the terminology that we employ to describe can frame things, which are it's given me something to think about. But no, that was absolutely fantastic, and I think it's really useful for students, whether they be doing English or social sciences or sociology or any other subject, to continue to read lots, read things. It's really valuable. So I think we should come back and do more podcasts on books in the future. But if you are interested in crime and the various aspects of crime and other academic subjects that are taught, do visit our website at www.staffs.ac.uk, where you can find out about all our courses here and studying at Staffordshire University. Beyond that, if you've been interested in this podcast, go to Buzzsprout or Spotify or iTunes, where you can download more of Crime Tapes. And finally, a massive thank you to my co-presenter, Kyla Lawton.
Hello, bye.
Hello and bye, the resident Marxist. And thank you very much to Mark Brown.
The book dude.
Mark Brown, thank you ever so much for joining us. It's really appreciated.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And we will have you back on again because I want to do more books. And it's bye from me, James Treadwell. Thank you.
Crime Tapes couldn't happen without the remarkable students and staff in the Staffordshire University School of Law, Policing and Forensics. Do you see yourself as a crime investigator? researcher, or even preventing crime and protecting the community on the front line in the police force? Whatever your future holds, a great education is the first step into making it a reality. Browse our courses at staffs.ac.uk and discover your potential.